Today we're going to be reviewing the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Now sadly, while most Grand Cherokees would never see real off-road use, with the most being a trip to your mother-in-law's cottage, the golf course, or maybe even a soccer field, we're going to be taking a look under the hood and underneath this Grand Cherokee to see what's inside and what makes it the traditional SUV that it is. And we're going to start under the hood where we have Chrysler's corporate 3.6 liter Pentastar V6. It's situated longitudinally in the middle of the engine like a proper SUV should be for rear-wheel drive. Now this one being the Trailhawk model, it has a proper four-wheel drive setup. Taking a look at how things are laid out under the hood here, we've got the airbox situated on this side here that's going to bring air into this air intake plenum. Now this engine is longitudinal, which means you have 3 cylinders on this side and 3 cylinders on this side, with the drive and accessory belt section located up here. Over here we have the coolant jug, we have the ECU computer, the fuse box, and then at the back here there's a breakout terminal that goes to the battery, which is actually buried underneath the passenger seat. Now we're going to start by taking a look at the air intake setup. We've got cool air that's drawn in at the front here that heads over straight to the air box where it gets filtered out. Then we have this nice large plastic pipe here that's going to bring that air straight into this drive-by-wire throttle body, just past the air intake temperature sensor, and then into this plastic intake plenum. Now just beside that we have an air resonator box in front here, and then one at the back here. That's just to help with the sound characteristics. Now changing the air filter on the Grand Cherokee is pretty simple. Just got 2 clips that you remove here, push this box out of the way, and then you've got easy access to the air filter here. Now with the air intake out of the way, it really frees up a lot of room in this engine bay, and you can definitely tell with the amount of space inside of here how Chrysler is able to stuff a Hellcat engine in here for the Trailhawk version. Now this engine bay is going to be pretty easy to work on because there's a lot of room inside of here, especially with just a smaller V6 engine. Now regardless, we do have clear access now to this drive-by-wire throttle body. You can also see where the upper plastic intake plenum joins to the lower intake plenum, and this here is actually also made of plastic, and they're just bolted together with some gaskets in between, and that's what bolts directly to the head. Now at the top of this intake plenum we have the purge valve for the evap system that's going to bring those vapors to be reburned. And because of the asymmetrical design of this intake plenum, you can see that the right half of the engine is pretty much covered with the intake plenum, so you'd have to remove it in order to service anything underneath. This half here is completely open. Now looking along this right side here, you can definitely tell it's going to be a little tight with this intake plenum. Now at the front here we do have the EGR valve, which is going to take exhaust gases and reburn it back into the intake for pollution control. Now if we move to the top of the engine itself, we have plastic valve covers located on either side here. This does take 0W 20 weight oil, and the oil dipstick is located way at the back here. Now perhaps a little awkward is the oil filter placement, which is located right at the top of the engine in between the 2 cylinder banks. I like though that Chrysler's already included 2 hooks here so you can lift the engine out when it blows. Now taking a look underneath the Jeep Grand Cherokee's underbody, you can see we've got a fairly flat underneath here. At the front here we have a plastic cover. Then in the middle part here underneath the engine we have a metal cover. That's to protect the engine oil pan. Now the transmission just behind it is left completely open, and further behind that we have the exhaust resonator. Then behind that we've got these 2 plastic panels near the rear suspension. And this undercover is actually pretty solid, and luckily it has a cutout here so you can change your oil without removing it because it is pretty heavy. Now with that undercover removed, you can see we've got clear access to the engine oil pan over here. You can also see the steering motor as well as the front differential. Now further down at the back there is the transmission, and then underneath the other skid plate is the transfer case. Now down underneath the Grand Cherokee we've got this little steel oil pan here that holds the engine oil with the drain port located over here. All of the bolts are pretty easy to access in case you need to change this gasket. Now there is an upper oil pan above it that is made of cast aluminum. Now if we take a look at the front half of the engine here, underneath this timing cover and this valve cover, we have a dual overhead cam design that's powered by a timing chain, which is good because you don't have to replace it over the life of the engine. Here you can see we've got the connectors for the oil control valves for variable valve timing on both the intake, both on the inside here, and the exhaust side on the outsides over here. Now just in front of those timing covers is the drive belt setup. You can see at the bottom here we have the crank pulley, we have the tensioner, we have the alternator over on this side, we've got another idler pulley on this side, and then over here we've got the water pump and the AC compressor. Everything here is really easy to access. All you got to do is put a wrench on this tensioner here, wind it backward, and then you're able to peel off this belt. Now replacing the alternator on the Grand Cherokee is pretty straightforward. Once that belt is off, there's just a couple of bolts here to remove the bracket, and then it should just come right off. You can see where my hand is, there's a lot of room to work back here and swing your ratchet. Now working on the AC compressor is pretty straightforward. It's accessed right from the top here with a couple of bolts that hold it to the block. Once these lines are off, it's pretty easy to just take right off. Now if you follow this EGR valve down to the bottom there, if you look closely, you can see that there's an EGR cooler, and that's where the gases are cooled off before it goes into the air intake plenum. Now over here at the rear right corner of the engine, just behind the dipstick, we have the PCV valve. Now its rounded body is actually driven off of the exhaust camshaft and forms part of an oil separator. Now, so it separates any oil coming from the valve cover area before it goes into the PCV system to limit the amount of oil in the intake plenum. Now looking on top of the driver's side of the engine here, you have clear access to the 3 ignition coils, so you can change these spark plugs out pretty easily. Over here we have the variable valve lift solenoid. That's right, this basically has VTEC on the intake side, where there's a separate set of cam lobes here that will vary according to engine RPM to give you more power. Now obviously on the passenger side you are going to have to remove this big intake plenum in order to get access to the valve cover and the spark plugs on this side. Next up we're going to take a look at the fuel system on the Grand Cherokee, and it is pretty straightforward because this is a port injected engine. Now the low pressure pump inside the tank is going to bring fuel pressure to these fuel rails over here, one for this bank here and one underneath the plenum for that bank. It'll then inject it down into these injectors that you can see here directly into the intake plenum before going into the head to get burned. Now one thing I don't like what Chrysler has done is they've screwed this plastic fuel rail to this plastic lower intake plenum using self-tapping screws, which means that if that strips out, you got to replace the whole intake. And now we'll have a listen to the engine startup sound. Now one thing I do appreciate about having an old school Jeep is that it still uses a solid metal radiator support, which is good because it won't crack in a small collision. What I don't like, however, is how exposed the wheel liners are. There's no metal or anything here. This wheel liner, you can just push it down and have clear access to say hi to your suspension. Also, what's good about having a lot of space under the hood is that it's pretty easy to access your headlight bulbs. You got good access down inside of here. However, on the passenger side, the coolant reservoir is in the way. At least they were nice enough to give you this little access panel on the inside of the wheel liner. Next up, we're going to take a look at this transmission, which is somewhat a weak point on many Chrysler vehicles. Here you can see we've got the 8-speed automatic transmission. It's got a plastic oil pan with these fins on it. Here we've got these 2 coolant lines here that go to the ATF warmer, so we do have a cooler up at the front, and we've also got a warmer at the back here to warm it up on cold starts. Now changing transmission fluid on the Cherokee could be a little chore. At least they do give you a drain plug, unlike the Wrangler. They also have a fill plug located right at the top here. However, you do need a scan tool to make sure you're at the right temperature before you pull the fill plug and allow the excess to make a big mess down over here. Now Jeep does use a shift-by-wire system, which means you have this little plastic link here that's connected to an electric motor to shift your gears from park reverse to neutral and drive, instead of using a cable to link you above to the shifter. Now good luck if you have to replace a starter on one of these. It's located underneath the driver's side catalytic converter. Way up inside of there, you might have to remove the engine mount or maybe drop the subframe a little bit to get access to it. Now once the transmission is done changing its gears, the power is then going to come over to this transfer case located underneath this guard here. Now this has an electric motor located over here, which is going to electronically engage the 4x4 system in order to send power to the front wheels. Now this Jeep does have a proper low gear range in this transfer case here, and that's what makes it so off-road capable. Now servicing the transfer case is pretty straightforward. Once you do remove the splash guard here, there are drain and fill ports. Now taking a look at this front differential here, we've got the prop shaft that runs from the transfer case over to this front differential. Now it's mounted to the subframe down here to 3 bushings, one at the front, one at the back, and then one over at the side here. Now servicing this differential is pretty easy. You have a fill port over here and a drain port over here. Now that differential is then going to distribute the power to the front wheels through these CV axles on this side and one underneath this bar. Now unlike many lower regular passenger vehicles where the differential actually bolts to the engine housing and the shaft has to run through the oil pan, this one's got enough room to house the differential and the shaft below the engine itself. Now once the transfer case is done sending some power to the front wheels, the remaining power is going to be powered to the rear wheels, so this drive shaft here, which runs above this exhaust resonator and then out to the rear differential. Now that drive shaft is going to bring its power to this rear differential. Now because this is primarily a rear wheel drive vehicle, that's why it's nice and big and chunky, unlike other soft rotors. Now we do have an electric motor located off to the left side over here. Now servicing this differential is pretty straightforward. We have a drain port located over here and a fill port located on the side. Now of course that power is going to come from the rear differential over through these axles here. Now these are nice solid large axles because this is primarily a rear wheel drive vehicle. It'll then go into the hub here. There's a very unique style of boot that's actually pushed in instead of having the ribs like the traditional CV boot before it goes in to drive the wheel. Now Now underneath the hood of the Grand Cherokee, there isn't too many wires and hoses that you can't really identify. Everything's pretty simple, especially if you compare it to that Turbo Wrangler that I recently reviewed. Now the front here we have the ECU with this giant heatsink on it. Now, I don't typically like this, especially how it's so close to the front of the vehicle, because it's subject to heat from the engine and also collision impact. Now over here we do have a fuse box which is easily accessible. We've got all the fuses here and it's nicely labeled. Now underneath the windshield cowl on the passenger side, you can see we've got the cabin air filter just sticking out right there. Not sure how it's going to be exposed like that during the winter time. Over here we've got this knockout panel here for the positive terminal of the battery, so in case you need to boost it, you'd hook it up here. The actual battery is located underneath the passenger seat. And this here is the access panel underneath the passenger seat. Now of course, if your battery does die and you can't move the seat, you're going to have to manually figure out a way to move it in order to access this battery. However, there are some models that actually come with two batteries buried underneath here, an auxiliary battery and your regular 12-volt battery. Now underneath the Cherokee, you can tell some of its architecture is a little bit old, while some of it is pretty new. There's a mix of materials down here, a lot of aluminum, but there's also still a lot of stamped steel, including this tubular steel structure that runs around here to form the subframe and engine cradle. Now taking a look at the front suspension from underneath, we've got these cam bolts over here that'll control the camber, and that'll adjust this lower control arm here relative to the subframe. Now the control arm is made of a cast aluminum. Over here you can see we've got a hollow sway bar, and that's going to connect to the stabilizer bar link over here. Now up there, that also connects to a bracket which connects to the strut, and the strut connects to this lower control arm. Now further inside of here, we've got the CV axle as it goes out to the wheel. Now luckily this does use bolted on style bearings, so you don't have to use a press to change it out. From back here, we've also got access to the lower ball joint. Now this is pressed into the aluminum arm, so you will need a press if you do need to change it out, or you can just change the whole control arm if you want. Now I'm also pretty happy that they are using aluminum in the knuckles as well. It tends to save weight, especially on such a heavy vehicle. Now taking a look at the Cherokee's front suspension here, finally we've got a traditional SUV style suspension with a double wishbone design. Here you see we've got an upper control arm, you've got the knuckle over here, and then a lower control arm down at the bottom there. Now down inside of the wheel well here, you can see we've got the stabilizer link. Now this one uses a spherical bushing instead of an actual ball joint like down there to join to the sway bar, and this bushing attaches to a bracket that goes to the strut directly instead of to the control arm or the knuckle. Now materials are pretty mixed here. We've got stamped steel upper control arms, an aluminum knuckle here, you have forged inner and outer tie rods, and of course a steel stabilizer link. Now this is the right front wheel, and you'll notice that this vehicle has front steer. That's because it's a rear wheel drive bias vehicle, which means that the engine itself is shifted back, and in order to not bother the four-wheel drive setup, they've actually shifted the steering to the front of the vehicle over here, so the steering rack is in front of the engine. Now replacing an upper control arm on one of these is pretty straightforward with just two bolts over here, but the axis here is pretty tight because we do have this air suspension module in the way. Now also tied to the upper control arm is the ride height sensor for this air suspension system. Now this being the Trailhawk, it does have the air suspension system, which means that instead of having a traditional coil spring and strut, it uses this big airbag, you can say, which is going to inflate and deflate in order to give you a higher ride height or a lower ride height. Now this does have a complete setup, including a compressor and an air tank. Now the air suspension setup features these air lines here that come from the compressor and plug into the strut at the top directly. And if you follow those air lines, it actually leads to the air compressor located in and behind the passenger side headlight. Now replacing the lower control arm on one of these isn't too bad, though it is a little bit involved. You got to release the ball joint here from the knuckle, remove it from the strut assembly over here, and then at the back here you got a couple of bolts that tie it to the subframe. Then of course you've got your front cam bolt over here, and then the control arm should be free from the vehicle. Now having a double wishbone suspension on an SUV is a really good thing, because not only does it enhance ride quality and handling, but it also helps with articulation off-road. However, if you're planning on owning one of these, specifically the trail version which has the air suspension, things are going to be pretty expensive to replace down the road. There's a lot of components here that could potentially wear out compared to a McPherson design, not to mention the air suspension setup that could obviously leak. It also has got other components, including the compressor and the air tank, that could also fail. Now taking a look at the rear suspension on the Grand Cherokee, things are even more complicated than the front. We have a multi-link design here with the strut located at the top here. We've got the upper control arm over here, and then we have what is supposed to be a trailing arm, but it's actually bent around this giant air spring. Now of course this air spring is going to inflate and deflate to change the ride height. It's got quite some size to it. Now the lower control arm is quite unique because it ties in at the back of the frame here, as well as at the front of the frame down behind the spring here. Now it supports the spring itself, as well as the shock absorber and the stabilizer link. Additionally, at the back here, we have the lateral link that controls the rear toe. Now the back here, we've got a mixed use of materials. We have aluminum used in this control arm here, as well as this lower control arm. The top here has stamped steel. We've got a forged rod for the lateral link, and the knuckle itself is made of steel. Now from the bottom here, you can see just how complicated that lower control arm is, having to support the strut, the stabilizer, and this air spring. Now at the bottom here, it actually joins to a ball joint instead of a bushing like most vehicles. So this ball joint, of course, could wear out because it's a loaded ball joint that carries the load from the spring and should have to be pressed out and replaced. Now unfortunately, replacing rear bearings means you have to remove the knuckle from the vehicle and take it to a press to press it out. Now unlike the front, the shock absorber is a separate unit from the air suspension unit, and it's pretty easy to replace. There's just two bolts up inside of there that you remove, and then the bolt at the bottom here on the lower control arm. Here you can see you've got the rear stabilizer link as it joins to the lower control arm, and then to the sway bar as it goes over to the other side. Now just like the front, the rear subframe is made of a stamped steel design. And here's another look at that rear suspension from underneath. You can see the monstrosity of the rear control arm, especially because of the size of that rear air spring over there. Now one thing I find interesting is that there's a giant cavity behind the bumper here. It seems like they could have either expanded a fuel tank or dropped down the cargo tray a little bit more, or even put the spare wheel underneath here, but it just seems like wasted space. Next, we'll take a look at the exhaust setup on the Grand Cherokee. Now from the right side here, it's pretty difficult to see, but I can guarantee you there is a catalytic converter on that side. Now over on this side here, you can see that catalytic converter down inside of here and its oxygen sensor. That's bolted directly to the head. There is no external exhaust manifold. It's all integrated into the head. Here's what the right side catalytic converter looks like from underneath. You can see the downpipe is then going to pass this control arm bushing over here, go around the transmission, and then into the resonator behind the transfer case. Now because this is a V6, you have two banks of exhaust, so there's another pipe running along the left side of the transmission. Now one thing I find interesting is how Jeep's using these clamps to join sections of the exhaust together. Here we've got a straight pipe here going into a piece that's joined to a flange, which is going to be joined to the resonator over here, whereas over on this side here is just a straight pipe that's welded to a flange. I'm not really sure the reason why they've done this, but it's definitely going to make it easier if you need to unclamp this to change either of these pipes out when it rusts out. Now I do have to give kudos to Chrysler for using the right kind of material for the exhaust. Most of the new cars I review do have a rusty exhaust, and they're brand new as well. Now that exhaust is then going to go through this mid resonator over here and then split off again into these two pipes before going into the muffler. Now those exhaust pipes are going to run to individual mufflers at the back here and then straight out the tailpipe. There's no fake exhaust tips, it comes straight out the back. And now we'll have a listen to the exhaust. Now the Grand Cherokee has three main engine mounts, one on each side of the engine. You could barely make out one on this left side here. Then if I move over to the right side here, we've got the bracket we're looking at underneath for the other mount. And then finally at the back here, underneath the transfer case skid plate, we have the crossbar that holds the transmission up. Next, we're going to take a look at the braking system on the Grand Cherokee. Now it starts over here underneath the windshield cowl, where we have a vacuum powered brake booster and a typical master cylinder with these lines over here. Now if you follow the brake booster's vacuum line, it actually comes to this T-point here and then goes out to this electronic vacuum pump. That's right, the engine's vacuum doesn't necessarily draw enough vacuum for that vacuum booster, so it relies on an electric pump to do that. Now if we follow the brake lines out of the master cylinder, it goes right down to the bottom here where we have the ABS module. This is going to control the traction stability control as well as any autonomous braking and safety features on this vehicle. Speaking of autonomous braking features, it actually surprises me that you can option out a $40,000-$50,000 Jeep Cherokee and still not have any autonomous braking features or radar sensors in the bumper here. I mean, you could get that on a base model Corolla. Now taking a look at the front brake setup on the Grand Cherokee, we've got a floating caliper design here on a disc rotor. Now this is a dual piston design for better braking forces. This is a heavy vehicle after all, although I'm kind of disappointed this rotor is not even bigger. Now because the steering rods are located on the front of this vehicle, the brake caliper is located at the back. Taking a look at the rear brakes on the Grand Cherokee, we've got a floating caliper on a disc rotor. Now this disc rotor is almost the same diameter as the front rotor, although this caliper is so puny and small for such a big vehicle. Luckily though, inside of this drum we do have a mechanical drum style parking brake that you activate with your foot. There's no electronics squeezing the caliper here. Next up, we're going to take a look at the cooling system on the Grand Cherokee. Now this is a pretty basic setup, so we can expect the cooling system to also to be pretty basic. You've got a coolant jug over here with the pressure cap at the top, just two lines coming off of it, one that splits down over here to the EGR cooler. We've got another one here that goes to the radiator. This also splits off to the thermostat located over here. Now if we take a look in behind the radiator here, you can see there's a lot of room to work inside of here. We've got the lower radiator hose that comes across over here, and that heads into the engine block over here, just where the water pump is located in the engine block. Now similarly at the top here, we've got the upper radiator hose that goes straight to the engine here. Now it does have a plastic thermostat housing at the top here. Now in behind here we do have an electric cooling fan, which is good because most rear-wheel drive vehicles used to use a mechanical cooling fan attached to the crank. Now the thermostat's pretty easy to replace. It's just a couple of volts to remove this plastic housing here, and then there's a traditional thermostat inside. There's no electronic valve like much newer vehicles. Now working on the water pump is again pretty easy, especially given the space behind the radiator. Just a couple of bolts that hold it onto the block, and you take off the belt and it comes right off. Now other than an extra loop that goes to the transmission warmer down below, that's pretty much it for this cooling system. Now the only downside to the cooling system is that the condenser and transmission cooler as well as the radiators kind of squeeze in this location here. Now in order to remove the radiator, you actually need to remove the AC condenser, which is integrated with the ATF cooler, which means that you have to remove this front bumper. Now from underneath here we can see the Jeep Cherokee's electric power steering motor located underneath that skid plate. Now looking at the Grand Cherokee steering setup, we've got this pinion shaft here that comes from the steering shaft. It'll then come down to this rack over here, which is going to take it out to the wheels. Now I like that even the rear skid plates covering the gas tank at the back here are made of metal instead of plastic. That's probably because this is the Trailhawk version and it all comes with these metal skid plates. Now the fuel tank itself on the Grand Cherokee is made of plastic. Now because you do have the drive shaft and the exhaust in the way, it does come in a two-piece design where you have a sub pump on this side and the main pump on that side. Unfortunately, accessing the pump or the filter is pretty difficult. You can't get it from inside like a normal vehicle. You actually have to drop the whole tank down, which means you got to remove the drive shaft and the exhaust system. Now the evap canister is buried underneath the rear left wheel well. Now overall, mechanically speaking, I do like the Jeep Grand Cherokee because it's a very simple design. Now although Chrysler does have quality issues and it's not known for its reliability, I do have to give my hats off to Chrysler for offering an SUV that is actually capable of going off-road, unlike many other soft-roaders out there, even though this is a really aged design. Now you tell me in the comment section down below, what do you think of the Jeep Grand Cherokee and the related Dodge Durango? Do you think Chrysler should redesign this decade-old design or not touch it at all? Make sure you follow me on Instagram for more behind-the-scenes footage and subscribe for more videos just like this one.